Hello and welcome to The Stack. On this week's show, I speak with the editor-in-chief of Garden and Gun, a title celebrating the South of the USA. Plus, Brian Winter from America's Quarterly on the Mexican elections. And we take a slow trip to Britain with Liz Schaffer from Lodestars Anthology. Enjoy the show. From Midori House in London, this is The Stack, 30 minutes of print industry analysis, and I am Fernando Augusto Pacheco. We start the show in Charleston, South Carolina, to speak with the editor-in-chief and senior vice president of Garden and Gun magazine, which in fact is not necessarily about gardens or guns. Stay tuned to find out more where the name came from. The magazine is a celebration of all things South in the United States, a well-crafted title that also shows the resilience of regional magazines in the country. Here is my conversation with David DiBenedetto.
I usually start by telling anyone who's not familiar with the magazine that it's not about gardens or guns. It is a Southern lifestyle magazine, and we can get into the name in a minute, but I'm fortunate enough to say that it's about everything that I love about the South, whether you're talking about its people, its stories, its culture. We certainly have a connection to the land. You know, there's a sporting element to Garden and Gun. I hope that every issue is a bit of a surprise for folks in what they see and also an introduction to, you know, this land that we love.
Are you from the South itself?
Yes, I am from Savannah, Georgia. So we're based in Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah is about 2.5 hours south of here.
And one interesting thing about, especially perhaps the United States, that there are great magazines that are being made outside, you know, the coasts. You don't need necessarily to be in LA or in New York. And that's fascinating, right?
It's a great point, right? Right out of college, I went to New York City and got a job as a fact checker at Men's Journal magazine, which was owned by Jan Wenner at the time. And I'd only ever wanted to be in magazines. So it was a dream, right? And I was in New York City working at Men's Journal and then Field and Stream, which was part of Time Inc. I wrote a book for HarperCollins. I never thought I would be able to leave New York City and go to a magazine of such quality and such content that I felt so familiar and proud of.
And it's interesting, I mean, we're talking about regional titles, I mean, but the United States is such a vast country. You're almost talking about a country. When you count population, the growth of states like, you know, Florida, Texas, for example. So I think when we say regional, people sometimes might misunderstand what I mean with it.
It's a very good point, right? And what's interesting about Garden and Gun, while it is a Southern lifestyle magazine, over 40, I think it's 42% of our subscribers are outside of what we would consider the South. And New York and California are two very, very big states for us when it comes to subscribers. And we have about just around 400,000 subscribers.
And it's so interesting. I would like you to come back, you know, to talk about the title, Garden and Gun, because yes, it is not a magazine about guns or a gardening title. Where did the name come from?
So it's a really interesting story. It was inspired by this club in Charleston. And I will say, I got to the magazine a year after it was started. So I wish I could claim this, but I can tell the story. There was a club in Charleston called the Garden and Gun Club. And it was very much like the Studio 54 of the South. And the way I understand it is when the bars closed in town, they used to have to close, I think, around midnight. But because the Garden and Gun Club was a quote unquote club, they could stay open. And everybody went there and they had the time of their lives. So when you're in this town and you find someone who went to the Garden and Gun Club and you mention it, you just see a warm smile come over their face. And what I love about it is that it was a very inclusive club, right? And that's how I want this magazine to feel. You know, I want it to feel the team works every day to make this a very, very inclusive magazine. You know, this is not a magazine that shies away from the horrible past of the South, but we also hope to celebrate how we're moving forward in positive ways.
And it's a magazine that looks beautiful. I have to say, it's quite a sizable title. So I have here the most recent one, the June-July issue. How many pages? I mean, it's about 190 pages, which is incredible.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the sign of a healthy magazine, especially, because a lot of magazines, sometimes they're dwindling down. They're very thin, they're almost not there. But that's not the case of Garden and Gun.
We're lucky from a revenue standpoint, from a consumer engagement standpoint. The magazine continues to do really well. And, if you hear me knocking on wood, I'm doing it because we both know how tough this industry is. And like other titles, we're navigating changing newsstands, cost of paper, cost of distribution. I mean, those are actual challenges that we feel, but speaking of feeling, you can feel that paper, that's one right away, right? The paper quality, it's not something we're going to skimp on. We want it to feel lush, and you'll see that photography and how well that takes to the page and the design, all of it meant to carry the reader into a space that they don't want to leave.
And, talking about the latest issue as well, even though I have to say, I was in the US, actually, I did buy the April-May issue, which was fantastic. It looks amazing. It was the arts edition. But this time is all about travel. Yeah,
right. So typically our June-July issue is about travel. And this year we went outside of the South. And that's what's nice about an issue, a magazine that, we're approaching 18 years old. We can push the boundaries a little bit for sure. So this whole issue, this whole travel package, I should say, is about travel outside of the South. It's about finding the DNA of the South in places you go. So there's the great Francis Mays on, Cortona, Italy. We're talking about, finding the South. Helen Ellis, the great humorist Helen Ellis, talking about finding the South in New York City or the British Virgin Islands. It's a mindset that certainly moves. And I love this issue because it's a little surprising, right? But who doesn't? We're not stuck to our roots here, right? We all love to get out and see something beyond our borders.
I agree. I mean, I think especially old subscribers will be excited or something new.
Oh, yeah. It was fun. It was fun for the whole team, right? It was a fresh package that we could tackle.
And talking about subscribers, is that how the majority of your readers come across the magazine? Through subscriptions, or do you still have quite a lot of kind of sales points across the region or across the country?
This magazine does really well on the newsstand, without getting into numbers. We do a number of percentage points better newsstand sell-through than a lot of magazines do. And, we're in Grand Central Station, we're in LAX, we're certainly, across the country. What's nice about that is when somebody finds us, we're kind of sticky. When they find us and maybe they're interested in traveling the South, outside of the South, or that arts issue, and they pick us up for the first time, we've got a pretty good turnover. We have a pretty good connection, I should say, and they become subscribers. And that's really nice. And those year over year subscribers, those numbers are really, really good too, which is a blessing, and also something that keeps me up at night, because you don't just get that. you got to work at it, and you don't want to lose it, right?
It takes time, even organic growth. I mean, to maintain, that's the hard part.
That's been a secret, right? To this magazine's success has been its grassroots growth. Our gifting program, which every magazine has a gifting program, but you can't imagine how many folks want to gift Garden and Gun, to their friends, and whether those are Southern friends or friends who live outside of the South, and they want them to understand this world that they so love.
And I think you're lucky as well in that sense, David, that I think the South, that area in the United States, is going through tremendous growth. A lot of migration, even within the country, right? Everybody's looking at that region in a way.
We often talk about the global South. Right. I mean, there's so many cultures that are coming and melding here and, taking, whether it's a Vietnamese dish, right, that then has a Southern spin put on it. That's exciting to me. Right. I mean, just taking some of these traditions and mixing them up a bit and growing what we know and growing, how we feel about them. It makes me tingle sometimes.
And I think we can review here that there's a new podcast series for Garden and Gun coming out soon.
Yeah,
right?
So I mentioned that, sporting that wing shooting and fly fishing, the higher end of the sporting world, is part of Garden and Gun's DNA. And so I'm part of a podcast with a fellow contributor, T. Edward Nickens, called The Wild South. And we've spent the last 8 episodes where we interview icons in this world. And really what's been so neat, Fernando, is these folks who everyone knows so well, getting to understand how much they care about the environment and what they're doing to protect it, right? And understanding that connection to the natural world is how we get people to care about it. And so if we can do that, whether that's through fly fishing, hiking, river rafting, whatever it may be, if we can get people outside, we can get them to care. And, certainly we talk about the South, but it's a global issue, as you know. So it's been fun.
And it's interesting you mentioned fishing. I like fishing, actually, but
you do.
I just don't do it enough. It's a nice thing. Do you fish?
A lot. You could say I'm mildly obsessed.
You need to give me some tips after, David.
Yeah. I would love for you to come to Charleston and take you fishing. I would love it. I love nothing more than sharing my passion for fishing with others.
Thank you very much, David. And if I ever head to the South, let's go fishing together. The latest issue of Garden and Gun is out already. For more, go to gardenandgun.com. Stay in the U.S. to New York now. A pleasure to speak again with Brian Winter, Editor-in-Chief of America's Quarterly, an insightful title about Latin America. From the latest on the upcoming Mexican presidential election to a new hotspot for shipping in Chile. It's worth a look. Here is my conversation with Brian.
It's interesting to be having this conversation about how the world sees Latin America during a U.S. election year. Because while it is true that there is coverage of Latin America in the foreign press in general, and the U.S. press specifically, most of it, especially now, tends to be through the lens of immigration, drugs, and other things that have a direct impact on the rest of the world. And I was a foreign correspondent for a long time. I worked for Reuters. And I understand the impulse that comes from. But what America's Quarterly tries to do is look at the region's politics, its economics, and sometimes its culture through a different lens, through the lens that what happens in this region of more than 600 million people is relevant for its own reasons. And that's kind of the approach that we take.
Well, and it's a very complex region as well. So sometimes a simple take won't do. And I have to say, the very first edition of America's Quarterly this year was talking about a historic year in terms of elections in the continent. And the Mexican election, which is coming up very soon and is very, very interesting. First of all, it's 2 women, which is quite remarkable in that sense. I think you guys done an incredible coverage of the Mexican election. What do you have to say about that coverage for America's Quarterly?
Well, we had the 2 main frontrunners, Claudia Sheinbaum of the current governing party and Xochitl Gálvez of the opposition, on our cover. And the headline was "A Historic Year," pointing to the fact that there are several elections happening in Latin America as well as the world this year. It's something like 1 out of every 4 people on the planet will cast a vote this year. That's remarkable. And 5 or 6 elections in Latin America as well, depending on whether you count Venezuela, which is perhaps a different conversation. But the reason we called it a historic year was obviously because of the historic nature of this race in Mexico, the fact that they will have their first woman president. That is something that Mexico would join. The big countries in the region have already had that happen. Brazil, of course, had Dilma Rousseff. Argentina has had female presidents, including most recently Cristina Kirchner. But it's not a barrier that Mexico has yet crossed. And of course, it's a barrier that the United States has not yet crossed either. So in these ways and others, these are countries that they're more advanced than some others.
And in terms of coverage, Brian, you will remember there's been a talk a decade ago, perhaps, about the pink tide, where, a lot of center-left governments in power in Latin America, or perhaps the more right-wing wave. I don't see waves anymore. I think every country is having their own time. Just look at Argentina and Brazil. They couldn't have more different governments at the current stage, right?
What we see more than any leftward or rightward trend in Latin America in recent years has been an anti-incumbent trend. Really, for more than 10 years now, the trend has been that people are unhappy with the way things are going in their country. They're unhappy with whoever is in the presidential office, with politicians in general. And so therefore, they tend to vote for something different. Sometimes the most different thing they can find. And that explains how someone like Javier Milei could get elected in Argentina. And we saw that happen here in the United States as well with Donald Trump back in 2016. But it is worth noting that this may be the year that breaks the trend. I suspect that Luis Abinader, who's the president of the Dominican Republic, is expected to be reelected. And in Mexico, the race that we're highlighting, the current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he cannot be reelected because of the Mexican Constitution, but his preferred successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, is expected to win and win by a comfortable margin. So, once again, just it seems sometimes, Fernando, where you get your head around a trend and then just as quickly it changes.
Exactly. Brian, who is the reader of America's Quarterly? I have a feeling that it's a strong presence in the United States, but is it kind of perhaps people from the region as well, or maybe there's an international outlook to it?
Our reader above everything is a professional reader who is interested in Latin America, usually because of their job. I'm talking about people who are in the private sector, in the public sector, in the media, members of civil society, and that's the reason why they come to us. And this lets us write about the region with a certain sophistication. We do not have to introduce Argentina or Ecuador to our readers, which is very liberating. It lets us get into more nuance very quickly. But oftentimes it's a readership that is familiar with these countries, but is not following the news there on a day-to-day basis. And so our goal is to provide analysis of things, trends, and other things that are happening within the current reality. So, for example, we check in every now and then to see how Milei is doing in Argentina, to see how his agenda is progressing or not. And, note colorful things like this rock concert that he gave recently in Buenos Aires, where he sang and insulted people on the left, including Pedro Sanchez in Spain and others. As far as geography goes, a little less than half of our readership typically is in the United States, and a big percentage of the remainder is in Latin America itself. We know that we have readership in places, in foreign ministries and in governments all around the region, in companies as well. There's not that many places where if you are a Brazilian, you can read interesting, sophisticated coverage and analysis of what's happening in Colombia or Mexico. So the fact that we're in English and published from New York, despite that, you could say, we try to have a truly regional outlook. And I come by that honestly. I mean, your listeners can hear that I am American, but I lived for 9 years in South America between Brazil and Argentina, and sometimes think of myself as being almost local. Certainly my carnivorous habits were learned in that part of the world.
I know you love a good barbecue.
I do. And that sometimes feels like more the Argentine or the Brazilian than the American.
And I think, because Brazil, Argentina, how passionate people are as well. Like, if you write a tweet, there will be, no matter whatever opinion you have, there will be people attacking you, right?
Well, yeah, you have to get used to that if you're part of the public arena. But I always appreciate the fact that in both countries and many countries, I try to never lose sight of the certain humility that I think needs to come with being not only an outsider, but also being an American. I started this career. I've been writing and talking about Latin America for more than 20 years now, almost 25. And to be really honest with you, I started my career at a time when there was a lot more, how do you say this, conviction and perhaps arrogance in the foreign coverage of the world in general, but Latin America specifically. The coverage was imbued with this certainty that perhaps the English-speaking world knew what was best. This was the late 90s and the early 2000s. It was a different historic moment. I find that has changed a lot now across the board. And I think that there's a conscience of the fact that there are different paths to development, that governments from across the ideological spectrum can bring something to the table, and that in many ways there are things that Latin America can teach the rest of the world. I believe that wholeheartedly, and I'd like to think that our coverage reflects that with some regularity as well.
That's fantastic. And Brian, just finally, because the Mexican election is coming up, and I think Mexico is such an interesting country because even their leader, AMLO, that, of course, there are a lot of things to be critical about, a lot of good things, but he's an interesting character. I mean, it's hard to define his politics, right? Because he can embrace a little bit of the left, a little bit of the right. Even for me, I read about Mexico often, but it's quite an intriguing country for me.
Nothing will awaken the wrath of a certain part of a Mexican readership like calling López Obrador a leftist, because there are people who insist quite strongly, and I have to say quite compellingly, that he's something different or some kind of hybrid, as you just noted. I think above all, he is a model, perhaps for better or for worse, of the kind of politics that tends to prevail and be popular in today's world. Any conversation about his 6 years in office has to start with the fact that he has maintained strong popularity of between 50 and 60%, sometimes more, depending on the poll. That is somewhat consistent with Mexican presidents historically. It's a country where people tend to respect the person who is in office. Not the case with his predecessor, but if you look at previous ones. But to do that and to have that level of popularity today in the West, that is an accomplishment. It tells us something. It tells us that he has connected with the population, even though the economy has not performed that well. And in certain levels, such as crime, things have arguably moved in the wrong direction. But I think that he's been able to do some interesting things for the working class, increasing the minimum wage, increasing pensions for working class people as well. And look, he's out there every day speaking, rallying, polarizing. He definitely polarizes. He talks constantly about, in negative terms, about the other parties and the institution that he believes are, out to get him, so to speak. I would like to see a different kind of politics, perhaps a more old school kind of politics based on things like consensus building. But I would have to recognize that, and America's Quarterly tries to be about the world as it is, rather than the world as we might think it should be. And the truth is that kind of politics, López Obrador's kinds of politics, in today's context, they seem to bear fruit.
And Brian, finally, if somebody's interested to read more, just go to America's Quarterly. You have a great website. But can you subscribe as well to the magazine in there?
Yes, you can. Thank you for that question. Our website is americasquarterly.org. A subscription lets you also have access to our 4 print issues per year, which I still love reading long-form pieces, particularly in print. And we also have a podcast, the America's Quarterly podcast, that is weekly and not as good as your show, of course, but it gives a weekly overview of Latin American politics. So that may be interesting for people too.
Thank you, Brian. Always a pleasure. For more, go to americasquarterly.org. And finally on the show, let's talk travel with Liz Schaffer from the beautiful magazine Lodestars Anthology. Besides having just reissued with new content their Italian issue, they have a new book out with Hoxton Mini Press. It's called Slow Travel Britain, with 22 mindful journeys across England, Scotland and Wales. Liz tells me more about the book and the celebratory year for Lodestars Anthology.
This book is the first time I've worked with Hoxton Mini Press, and we came up with the idea together because I was really keen after COVID and moving away and 10 years of magazine making to create something that connected me back to Britain, which is the place I moved across the world to be in and something I wanted to explore more again.
And I think even people in those isles, they should rediscover their own country as well, because it is beautiful. And I think I looked with it with my Brazilian eyes as well. But I do think generally, even people here in London, they would appreciate a book like this.
Well, it was really fun. So I've worked with a group of brilliant photographers who've worked for Lodestars Anthology for years. And a lot of them are British. And when we were on the road together working on these 22 chapters, it was the first time they'd seen these parts of the countries. And it was lovely to watch somebody who grew up here, who's always had this in their back garden, do something entirely new.
Define slow travel in a way. I know many people might have an idea, but I think it's the ethos of Lodestars Anthology, in my opinion, right? Your magazine.
I didn't actually realise it was the ethos of Lodestars until I was making this book. I'd always assumed that slow travel was a little bit wild and a little bit difficult and involved being camped on mountains and getting trains and boats and feet. And that is part of it. Like, communing with nature is part of it. Opting to take a train rather than plane is part of it. But I think ultimately what I've learned is slow travel is about connection. And that can be to a landscape, to people, to history, to a piece of art, whatever you're doing that makes you take a moment to really connect and be mindful and aware of where you are and everything that has come before you.
Wow, I agree. And this is a hefty book, I have to say. About 240 pages in there. It's been quite a work, right?
It's so interesting with a book, with a magazine, you never have any idea of what it's going to feel like or really look like until it exists in your hands. Because you're on the ground and you're having these experiences. We spent a year, me and the photographers, travelling around England, Scotland and Wales, creating everything from scratch. I knew it was going to be beautiful because I saw these places and I saw the photos come in. But then to hold the book, it's something else.
And you've been to one of the most magical places in the UK. I mean, people might differ. People might have different views on it. But for me, it was the Brecon Beacons. I thought it was such a fantastic, iconic place. I was really impressed. And there's lovely pictures. I'm not going to ask your favorite, but is there any place that you would like to highlight, perhaps, that is featured here in the book?
God, there were so many. And every place. So the ethos of the book is to find an element of every place that makes it special. And it doesn't mean that this is the only place in the world where you can experience this thing or that they necessarily do it the best in the world. It just means that this is why I went to this place. So for Cornwall, I went for the artistic history. And that was wonderful. That was one of the early stories. And it was a chance to talk to artists in their studios about the work that they're doing, what that landscape means to them, how that light that's inspired generations of artists is still inspiring people today, and to connect back to that artistic history. And it's wonderful because it completely transforms the way you see a place that you'd always assumed was just a seaside relaxed getaway. I loved Pembrokeshire because I am a fan of foraging, and it is a county that is really working with wild food and doing amazing things on the restaurant hospitality front to incorporate wild food. I love going to Mull on Scotland's west coast because that completely changed the way I saw islands. I think islands in Britain, anywhere in the world, are tied up with this ideas of romanticism and splendid isolation, whereas I was having these beautiful conversations with a young couple who'd done up a shed on their uncle's property into a beautiful cabin. And we were sitting outside and a storm was raging across the water and waterfalls were flowing up the hill. And I was waxing lyrical about island life and wanting to run away. And they pointed out that, well, yeah, it's beautiful, but island life is going to always be tied up with this very, in many ways, tragic history and these hardships and this need for community, because without a community, there is no island life. And it was just this reminder to remember the realities when traveling of what life can be like. And that actually makes a place, to me, more beautiful. But everywhere we went, all 22 chapters, I would go again tomorrow. I
would like to do a little shout out to the lovely Nancy Durran in Hay Moy as well. I've been to her lavender farm, beautiful, and there's a lovely portrait of her in the book as well. That was gorgeous. That portrait was taken by Billy Charity, who is another Hay local, and I think it's just really special when you have someone from an area photographing somebody else from an area, and everyone is just talking about their love, and it's good. But Nancy's Lavender Farm is a magical place. And Liz, how are you? How is Lodestars Anthology doing? I know you guys just published a revisited magazine about Italy as well, you know, which is always good. I like this idea of revisiting the places, because that's the challenges of a travel magazine, a travel guide, or a travel book anyway, because sometimes you do have to update, right? Well, especially when the first Italy magazine came out about 18 months after I launched the business. Yeah. So what we have learned in the 8 years since then has just been astounding. And it's lovely to go back and to salvage some original stories, to create entirely new stories, and to work with our brilliant team of contributors. Because over the years, you pick up writers, you pick up photographers, and it might be that you don't get to collaborate for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, but you get to go back and work with them. And everyone's developed the way they capture a place and tell a story. So next up for us is actually a revisited Japan magazine,
which does seem to be the most popular place in the world right now. And
Going there in July. I hope it's published before then.
Not in time, but you always get a sneak peek.
Thank you.
And then, because it's been 10 years for us this year, I wanted to do something a bit different. So we're breaking away from the one country every issue and doing an issue dedicated to islands. And I do think that was inspired a bit by the book, this chance to go to Skye, to Mull, to Islay, to see island life up close and personal. I was like, that is really cool, because all three of those islands are on Scotland's west coast. They're connected by ferries, but they are worlds apart. And I think that's really interesting to show the diversity that you can find on islands.
And where are you based these days? I mean, I know you're a bit of a traveler. Have there been any stints in Australia? I know there was also the Revisited Australia, I think was published months ago. But
I've been thinking for the past couple of years a lot about what home means. And I think home changes. Home is people. Home is where you feel settled and rooted to a place. So I don't know where I am in the world. The book dedicated to sort of England, Scotland and Wales is meant to be my way of, saying farewell to this part of the world. And it was meant to be the grand tour of everything I wanted to see one more time or for the first time. And it was the most brilliant send-off, because we spent 10 months on the road seeing how phenomenal these countries are. So as much as I do want to return to Australia to live, I've been reminded of how gorgeous it is here, so I really don't know.
It's a tough question, I have to say. And what about the business? Because your magazine, I love the fact that you're doing more revisited editions, which I think is very important, especially when you're talking about Japan, Italy, Australia, big countries and countries that change as well. But how is the business doing? Do you think this idea of revisiting is very important for you guys, especially after 10 years in the business? Or there's still space for new countries, perhaps, on the pipeline?
I really enjoy that we've got to a place where it's that combination. It is these new projects completely from scratch, and then it's the chance to go back and, I don't know if improve is the right word, but just to do it differently. And I feel like we have such an appetite in those who buy the magazine, and I'm so grateful for that. And it's been proven that when we go back to a country that we've released before, people still buy that. And that means a lot, because it says a lot about the work as much as the destination. It is truly heartfelt words. It is images that take my breath away. And it's illustrations that are fun and beautiful and you want on your walls. And I think that's part of the appeal.
Thank you as always, Liz. And for more, go to lodestarsanthology.co.uk. And that's it for this week's show. My thanks as ever to our editor, Jack Juras. If you have any comments or queries, feel free to write to me, Fernando, at fp@monocle.com. And remember, we're back next Saturday at 10 a.m. London time. And meanwhile, you can always listen again at monocle.com, subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You've been listening to The Stack. I'm Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.